Hi, I'm Rob, and this is a quick introduction to Kubernetes YAML documents. Let's have a look. This is a YAML document that contains a single Kubernetes resource called a pod. You see up here, we've got an API version and a kind. You are going to see that in every single Kubernetes YAML document that you look at. In theory, there is a subtle difference between a kind and a resource, but the difference is beyond the scope of this conversation. In practice, most users in most cases can ignore the difference and use those terms interchangeably. And when I say resource, I just mean something that the Kubernetes API understands. That is, you can do CRUD operations on this thing. So what are the API version and the kind for? Well, the Kubernetes API is a RESTful API, which means it's accessed over HTTP, so it needs to have a URI. So these two elements are combined together to create the URI for this resource. So if we look at another Kubernetes resource here called a node, it doesn't matter what this is. You can see that the API version is set to v1 and the kind is node. And the URI for this resource is here with the API version first, followed by a slash, followed by the kind. Let's look at another resource type. This is called a certificate signing request. Again, it doesn't matter what this is, but this one, as well as a API version, also has what's called a group out in front of it, and that is included in the URI that gets generated. So it is the group, the version, and the kind that are put together to create the URI for any given Kubernetes resource. And you can see that here in the URI. Group, v1, kind, right there. Okay, next up, we have the metadata. This is just what it says on the tin. This is data about data. So in this case, it's data about this resource. I've given this pod a name. I've called it Nginx. There are other metadata elements you can express here that are standard to all Kubernetes objects. One that is quite common is a namespace. Doesn't matter what that means, but some Kubernetes resources can be namespaced. And so you would express that here. What I want you to take away from this is that the metadata key is set to a value which is a map. That is, it is a group of key value pairs. And here it is expressed in block style. But there's absolutely no reason that you cannot express this in flow style. When I save this file, you'll see that the representation doesn't change. In practice, however, most of the Kubernetes YAML documents you look at are going to be in block style for the metadata just because it's easier to read. Okay, next we have a spec. The spec is not present on all Kubernetes resources, but it is present on most of them, and it is how you tell Kubernetes what you want it to do. A pod resource is how you tell Kubernetes to run containers, so a pod spec is going to need a list of containers. And that's exactly what we see. We've got a key called containers whose value is a list. And there's a single element in that list, which is a map with two key value pairs. The key name and image represent the name of the container and the image file from Docker Hub to pull down and run. Now, again, in theory, you could express this in flow style. This is equivalent. Nothing has changed. But in practice, most manifests you see out there are going to express this in block style for readability. Because this is a list and because it is possible to run multiple containers in a single pod, I'm going to add a second container to this pod by adding a dash right here. Let's add another key value pair to one of these containers. I'm going to add a key here called args. Args is how you tell Kubernetes that you want to pass some command line arguments to the program being started in this container. Args expects a list, so I'm going to do this in flow style here, and it can be whatever. If I can spell it right, there we go. And all I want you to take away here is that when you are adding elements to a mapping, which is a list item, you do not need the dash out front. So you don't need a dash out front unless you intend to add a third container to this list of containers, and then you get a third list item here. Now, the only other thing I want to talk about today is this expression. You'll sometimes see these two empty curly parentheses in a YAML document for Kubernetes. The reason that you see this is because many Kubernetes resources have default values. So if you do not specify foo in this case, if I omit that from my spec, Kubernetes is going to give me some default values for foo, whatever they happen to be. And in this case, for whatever reason, I have decided that I do not want those default values for foo. Well, I can't just leave it blank because that sets foo to null. And when I apply this manifest to Kubernetes, I'm going to get a type error because Kubernetes is expecting a map and I'm sending the wrong data type. So it's going to throw me an error saying, I expected a map, you sent me null, no thank you. And I cannot express an empty map using block style because it still just interprets this as white space and sets it to null. So the only way to set this to an empty map is with the flow style empty curly parentheses. And this is how you tell Kubernetes, hey, whatever you've got by default, I do not want it. No thanks. That's all that means. So there is a quick intro to what you will find in most Kubernetes YAML documents. Check out our next video to learn how to choose the right keys and set them to the right values. Thanks.